There are so many moments in The Walking Dead that I could argue are the best moments of the show. It's actually really hard for me to trim down a list to just be the top 10, but we're going to try to do that in this video. So we're going to be discussing the top 10 moments for me in AMC's The Walking Dead TV show. I'm going to give a couple honorable mentions just because I feel like they are relevant. It is literally impossible to make a video just stating 10 of these. There's so many good moments in a show that's been out for 10 plus years with 11 seasons of its main show to count. It really is just impossible. So really 10 moments is basically equating to 10 seasons of TV, even though there's 11, blah, blah, blah. We're going to jump right in with my first favorite moment, and that being the "We are the Walking Dead" speech that Rick gives in season 5 within that barn. There's something just so interesting about a sequence like that where you're watching the character of a very serious TV show kind of almost break the fourth wall by stating the title of a name. And I know that's really a small detail in that, but it's not that I love so much about the show. It's the speech itself. It's Rick talking about his grandfather, Rick talking about how his grandfather essentially learned to be dead while he was alive. And that whole concept just so adequately made sense in the Walking Dead universe. It was really nice to see, and it was an amazing touch to see our leader touch upon such a dark topic and just to essentially end it by saying that we are the Walking Dead, just followed by Daryl basically getting up and disagreeing with them. It is such a beautiful moment in the show that I wish we got a little bit more of as the show went on. And I know for the most part it stayed like that, even though there was some Gimple speak throughout. I do think this was a special moment, and even brought more special by the episode, because that episode in general was just so strong with the storm in the barn and all of that. It was just such an iconic moment. But anyway, number 2 on this list is Rick's speech at All Out War at the conclusion of All Out War, essentially where after he slit Negan's throat and had Siddiq save him, he goes on this whole speech about how the war is over and go home and the work begins of building the new world. There is something so compelling about that speech, whether it's the music or whether it's what he's saying in particular, that just always rung true with me in such a crazy way. I loved the sequence of him saying, "We are life and that's death and it's coming for us." And he points to the big herd that really, really adequately sets up what is the Whisperer arc. It was just such an incredible speech. Something about it just worked. The clearing they were in, the visuals they were in, the speech in particular, the drama with Maggie, the concept of it being over saving and sparing Negan. Everything about that just came together in such a wonderful way that I really do think was arguably the best speech that Rick Grimes gave. There's many, many good monologues that he gave throughout the run of the show. This one, though, just, it really stood true on its own. It was very, very awesome. That's really the only way to put it. I personally think it's his best speech. Honestly, we got some really good ones in The Ones Who Live too, but this one was just really awesome. I can't pass it up. Really great sequence and otherwise a pretty shitty season. But yeah, now on to number 3. We have the clear scene with Morgan in season 3. The scene in particular I'm referring to is the one where Morgan is telling Rick that he turned on his radio every day at dawn and he wasn't there. The entire speech is phenomenal. And it's, I think, one of my favorite moments of all time in The Walking Dead, and that's why it's on this list. It probably is my favorite moment now that I'm thinking about it, but there's just something so eerie to me about that concept of him turning on his radio every day at dawn and he wasn't there, followed by Rick saying he kept getting pushed further and further out into the country and he didn't have a choice. There's something every time I listen to that just sums up what I fell in love with The Walking Dead for. It's that eerie, haunted world building that freaks me out in a visceral way. And that's what I loved about early Walking Dead. And it's captured so well in this conversation about a man who lost his son, who's trying desperately to find survivors out there. So his desperation leads him to searching every day at dawn on the radio. Like, there's just something so eerie about that, followed by the entire discussion about what happened to Dwayne, as well as how Rick's son could be dead because the good people always die, but the weak people don't. It is such a powerful conversation that I go back to and watch frequently. I don't I don't frequently go back to watch scenes from The Walking Dead like that, but this is one that I come back to a lot. And I think that's what sums up for me why Clear is the best episode. As you guys know, if you've seen my review talking about my favorite episodes of The Walking Dead, spoiler alert, Clear is my favorite episode. I absolutely love it. And it's specifically for this scene. I think it's just such a strong narrative that we don't get to see all the time in The Walking Dead, and it makes for something truly special. But the next up, this is an obvious one, and that's Negan's lineup monologue, specifically in season 6 with the cliffhanger. That whole speech is something that I hate to admit. I really hate to admit this, but I've memorized most of it. That's how many times I've seen it. That's pathetic, but it's absolutely true. It is such an amazing, truly amazing moment from the comics that we got to see to screen in a way that was almost 100% faithful to the comics. I mean, like, literally, this speech was ripped pretty much right from the fucking compendium. It's the same thing, except for the curse words, because obviously it's on a regular channel. We couldn't have the same cursing, and I wish we did. That's the one thing with Negan's arc that I think could have been so much better if he was allowed to curse, but his speech alone, even in a censored version, his speech alone was just so unbelievably good, and I'm so glad we got to see it. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's portrayal of him was just literally perfect. I can't think of any other casting than him for this role. And in general, the speech was so satisfying, cliffhanger or not. It was so good and so worth it. And it's another one, like I mentioned, that I come back to and watch frequently. You're kind of going to see, and I know I said I don't do this often, but realistically, you're going to see this list is like, if I do go back and watch one, it's from this list. It's because they're seriously my favorite moments ever. But anyway, obviously that's a given. Everyone has that one somewhere near their top 10. But the next one in particular that I like is another big Rick speech, and it's Rick's speak to Diana, I can't remember, Diana Monroe, in season 5, where Michonne knocks him out, where essentially he's talking about how they survive and how Diana set up the community is not how they survive, and how you have to choose who lives here and who doesn't. It's so powerful. The cinematography is so amazing with the red balloon flying up and stuff like that, and how you could tell like the camera has a weird FPS and it's cutting around when they're fighting and stuff like that. Just everything about that sequence is so strong, and Rick pulling a gun on the community to essentially be like, your way of doing things is over. It's such classic Walking Dead. It's so good. There's not really much else I could say about it. I just think it perfectly encapsulates what made seasons 1 through 5 of the show so strong, and it really is one of the last great speeches before the show started to decline. I know I said that Rick's speech is in there and stuff like that, but I'm talking about those speeches that had like the OG feel of The Walking Dead. This was one of the last ones of that. Season 8's speech was kind of in a different stage of The Walking Dead. Seasons 1 through 5 were really like classic Walking Dead, if that made any sense. Whatever. The next one on the list, this might be the most iconic sequence from the show. It's not a speech or anything like that, but my favorite moment is the No Way Out scene of them killing walkers after having brought Carl into the nurse's place because he got shot in the eye. The whole thing, realistically, when Jesse died and when the kid was freaking out, that from that moment onward, up until that big sequence of them all killing walkers together, it's just so incredible. It is in otherwise what I think a okay season. Like, season 6 is one of the greats, but it's not my personal favorite of the greats. Regardless, that sequence alone was one of the only times in The Walking Dead history where I was like, oh my God. When I watched it the first time, I was like freaking out. at my laptop that I was watching it on. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I remember exactly where I was when I saw that scene, and I know that's a little pathetic to say, but I was my family has a shore home, and I was watching it one night in the shore home, and I was watching it at like the bar stool, listening to it on my laptop. I was alone, no one was there, and that scene happened. I was like, oh my God, I was freaking out. I felt like such a nerd, but it's true. That scene just hit so well. It was such a good moment in the show, and this is a moment within the show that leads me to believe this is one of the greatest shows ever, even though I think it's greatly declined. That moment in particular was just one of those that stands out that I will never forget. From episodes of SpongeBob to Drake and Josh to Always Sunny in Philadelphia to movies I've seen, there's moments that stick with you. You know what I mean? And that moment stuck with me, just like Clear. Clear is another example of that with I turn my radio on every day at dawn, blah, blah, blah. That's another moment. Like, those things just stuck with me, and No Way Out scene really did. But the next one is Rick's final scene, and it's really just the bridge sequence overall. And honestly, it's hard to just say that it's the final scene, because season 9 episode 5 is such an incredible episode. I could probably put that whole episode as a moment, because there's so much, if you think about it realistically, whether it is, Herschel coming back into the story, Sasha coming back into the story, Shane coming back. There's so many strong moments of it. But by far the most powerful of those moments, it has to be Rick's final scene. And yes, I know Rick has came back since then, and he had a full sound conclusion, but that conclusion was so unbearably emotional that I don't know if it tops what happened in The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live. Like, that was emotional for a different reason, but what happened in the main show was a moment, and it was just so good. It was so sad. It was crazy seeing, like, it was one thing to see him explode. It was another thing to see Michonne's reaction, Daryl's reaction, and even like in the background you have, Carol's reaction as well as Maggie's. Like, all of those things just made for a very powerful emotional scene, because Rick's our main character. Obviously, it means something, and it's very strong when that person goes. And it's one thing to see it. It's another thing to see everyone's reactions to it. It was so phenomenal. I loved that moment, and it's still another one that I go back to. Like, if I'm rewatching The Walking Dead, this is an episode that I go back to frequently compared to others in the show. It was that good, especially that scene. But the next one on my list is the Pike scene. And really, when I say this, a lot of my memory of it goes more to the comics than it does the show. But I also think that the show's version, and that's the reason it's on my show list, the show's version perfectly brought to screen a comic moment. Yes, it didn't have the same characters at all. So the weight of it, the emotional weight, was entirely different. But it brought that visual style, that crazy shock value, and just overall that vibe that I got from the comics perfectly to screen. And it was the reason that I was really adamant about Angela Kang in that period of time, because it was just so good. And yes, we don't care as much if Tara's on the Pikes. We don't care as much if, Henry's on the Pikes, or even Enid. You know what I mean? Yeah, those characters aren't nearly as strong. And I fucking loved Enid, so that was a big deal for me. But regardless, those characters aren't as strong as seeing like Ezekiel on the Pikes or Rosita on the Pikes. You know what I mean? Like, those characters don't have as much emotional weight as the comic ones did, but the feeling stayed the same. And that's all that matters. That shock value, that Robert Kirkman feeling. I don't know how to describe that. It remained strong within the show in this season, even in this scene. I mean, even if it was the fucking Highwayman, who we don't care about at all, it was just still so strong to see with what we got in the show. It was absolutely incredible. But the next one that I have on the list is the whole entire Here's Not Here segment, specifically Eastman's monologue, where he's talking about, having new beginnings and starting over and blah, 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 and a fresh approach to things, and how you make a vow to not kill and all of that stuff. It was such a beautiful segment in, I think, one of the most beautiful episodes that The Walking Dead's ever done. Truly a phenomenal episode, and one that I go back to all the time to rewatch. It's one of the greats, and Eastman in particular just made it so unbearably strong. I loved it, and I loved the whole monologue where you saw Morgan's entire reformation into being a good person again and not wanting to kill with Aikido. It was so good, and I wholeheartedly can't for the life of me fathom not putting that episode in like a top 10 list. You know what I mean? It is such a strong, such amazing episode, and it's why I think Morgan overall is such a strong character. He really is truly phenomenal, and I think it's brought out here because of Eastman in such an iconic way. I love what that story brought for the character in particular. And then the last one of my top 10 moments is the Too Far Gone speech by Rick. I don't know how I couldn't include this in my main thing. And there's so many more. And that's what I'm saying. I know you guys are going to roast me in the comments for not having things like Shane in there, things like the barn scene with Randall and blah, blah, blah. I know you guys are going to get me for that. I could see it coming. Trust me. But look, this is my list of top 5s or top 10s. This is what made me fall in love with the show, is these moments. This is what kept me watching the show. This is what created this YouTube channel. You know what I mean? It's these 10 moments. But it's the Too Far Gone speech with Rick in season 4. And because I think it perfectly encapsulated that feeling that I was referring to earlier about it just feeling so Robert Kirkman. You know what I mean? And yes, it was a little different to screen. Like, obviously, some of the stuff we saw play out, and especially in particular, like, having it be the governor the way the governor was, it was totally different than the comics and all of that stuff. But that speech just perfectly encapsulated what I love so much about Robert Kirkman's comics, as well as the show. And at this point, when I started watching The Walking Dead, I didn't read the comics. So when I was seeing Too Far Gone, I didn't know this was something that kind of happened in a similar way to the comics. I had no idea. But watching it just felt so strong. And now in retrospect, I'm like, oh my God, this just felt so unbearably Robert Kirkman. But it's realistically because it did. It really did. I loved that speech. I loved what came after. I loved the fight that ensued with the governor, as well as the governor's death and all of that. The death of Herschel. There's just so much about that moment and what happened because of that moment that it's impossible to avoid. It was so good. It's one that I'll never forget. Just like all of these in this list, these are the reasons that I love the show this much. These are the reasons that this channel exists and that I'm clicking record right now at 12:23 a.m. on a Saturday night, which is pathetic to admit. I literally have no life. But whatever. I was going to give some honorable mentions. I'll keep them brief. One of them is Jesus' death scene introducing the Whisperers. I thought that was a really fucking awesome scene and one of the best from Angela Kang. Carl's death conversation was another really strong one. And I do have to admit, the whole barn sequence where they were talking about what to do with Randall was a very awesome moment. Shane's death was an awesome moment. And also, all of episode 1 of The Walking Dead, period, like the first episode, Days Gone By, all of those moments are so strong. Now, again, those are just some honorable mentions, but there are so many more moments I could think of. Like, another one, for example, is the whole Maggie and Negan scene both in season 9, episode 5, as well as in the final episode, season 11, with the whole thing where Maggie's like, I can't forgive you, but I'm going to try, blah, 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 all that stuff. Like, those sequences are phenomenal. There's just so many. I can't name them all. They're so fucking good. This show, all things considered, even though it had a pretty strong rise and fall, this show was just, it had so many good moments that it's hard to count all of them. I definitely want to hear from you what your moments were, so be sure to let me know down in the comments. And bye.